We're going to be starting a sermon series on prayer this week. We try to do this about once a quarter, one sermon, two sermons, five sermons, whatever it ends up being. We try to do at least one message, at least one series on prayer every quarter. I'm bad at titles, so the title is Lord, Hear Our Prayer. But the more I thought about it, the more it's like, it kind of fits. Because often, at least for me, and I imagine many of you are the same way, we pray and we feel like God doesn't hear us. And there's this recited thing that you might hear if you went to one of those like old-fashioned churches, almost as like a repeat, like a call and response type prayer. Anyone ever go to a church today like a call and response type prayer thing? Yeah, and I've heard this phrase in those settings. I've heard it in literature. I've seen it in movies, not like new movies that normal people watch, but like movies that like Bible college kids watch, because we aren't allowed to watch anything over PG-13. I have some Bible college stories, man, trust me. But this phrase, Lord, hear our prayer, I think it's appropriate because so often it feels as though God doesn't. Over the next 2 weeks, I don't want to answer, well, why does it feel like God? Because whenever you ask why God, it's kind of hard to answer that question. Who can know the mind of God, is what the scriptures say. Who can know the mind of God? But maybe there are some things that we can do, some practices we can work into our prayer lives that can help us be more aware of God's presence, to be more aware that He is listening. Now, He might be saying no, but He's listening. And this week, I want to talk about what I think is maybe the most impactful prayer practice that a Christian can have in their walk with Jesus. Maybe the most important skill to add to your prayer arsenal, and that is seasons of prayer. Now, that word season is a word that Christians use a lot, and it can mean like 100 different things. This is just a season of singleness. Young people, you've probably heard that before, right? It's just a season of singleness. This is just a season of grief after something bad happens to you or a loved one, or maybe you even lose a loved one. Well, this is just a season of unemployment. Many of us have been there, right, before. Not pleasant. And someone's probably said, some churchy person, well-meaning, like, this is just a season of unemployment. But God, that's always how they end it, right? But God. We use this word season to describe a lot of good things, a lot of bad things, and everything in between. And when I say a season of prayer, this is all I mean by it. A set-aside, fairly lengthy period of time, maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe a year, some undeterminate but lengthy period of time that you are devoting to praying over a single issue or a related group of issues. Normally, as we'll see in our scriptures today, these seasons are kicked off by a significant event or piece of news or something that just pricks your soul, something that just, it hurts inside or it stirs you to action. And so you commit to a period, a season of prayer. So is everyone kind of tracking with what I mean when I say a season of prayer? Does everyone get that? Head bobs? Head bobs, maybe? No head bobs? Do I need to keep going then? Yes. So we're going to be talking about this tool, these seasons of prayer that we can be using. And in order to discuss this issue, I want to talk about the book of Nehemiah. In so doing, hopefully we'll answer a question, and that is, how can I empower my prayer life? Or what is one way that I can empower my prayer life? Nehemiah, chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it starts with, well, the way that many of these sorts of books named after old Hebrew dudes start. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Who do you think this book is about? Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Yeah. Many of the prophets start with similar phrases, right? It just tells you who wrote it. Now, who is Nehemiah? Do we have any guesses? It sounds like we might be somewhat divided. Got a lot of answers there. I heard a prophet, and that's interesting. I don't think he fits the definition of a prophet, because he never hears directly from the Lord and then relays a message to the people. But he is a religious leader. He is certainly acting on behalf of God. So maybe he is gray area, maybe? I'm not sure he fits the definition of a prophet. But he is a religious leader and a civic leader of the Jewish people. But when this book begins, he is neither. He holds an important position in the Persian court. Now, he's Jewish, he is Hebrew, but he is living in the city of Susa, serving in the court of King Artaxerxes of Persia. King Artaxerxes of Persia. You guys ever seen like 300? Right, so his dad is that guy, Xerxes. And Artaxerxes literally means son of Xerxes. So it's easy to remember, right? He's serving in this court, and specifically he is a cupbearer. A cupbearer is someone who is responsible for choosing the wine that would be presented to the king, tasting the wine so the king was not poisoned, and then giving the wine to the king at mealtimes. So those were not probably his only responsibilities. He probably had administrative responsibilities. He would have been a close confidant of the king, someone who would have been selected for their discretion. See, as a king in ancient Persia, when you had the power to kill someone at the snap of a finger, it was kind of difficult to have close friends. And many times the closest thing that a king had to a friend outside of their immediate family who had less reason to fear the king, although not necessarily in every case, the closest thing that a king might have to a friend is their cupbearers, those in their court that are close that they can talk to about difficult things, and those cupbearers were expected to remain silent. In other words, Nehemiah was in a position of great influence. He was close to the king. The king would have confided in him. He would have had direct access to the most powerful person in the region in this period of history. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. Now, it happened in the month of Kislev. In the 20th year, I was in Susa at the palace, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some of the men of Judah came, and I asked them about the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. That phrase, escaped and survived the captivity. There's a little bit of history we need to do here, just a little bit more, and then I promise we can actually talk about prayer. The Jewish people had lived as a group of tribes, a confederation might be a good way to term them. Very loosely affiliated individual states. These tribes were basically extended families. And they lived together in one area, and they knew the area as Israel. The ones who wrestle with God, literally what that phrase means. And these 12 tribes, they lived together in this area, each having their own territories except for the tribe of Levi, or the Levites, you might hear them called, who had cities that were spread all throughout the area because the Levites were the priests, the religious leaders of this loosely affiliated confederation. And so they had to be all around. After all, you don't want to live 12 hours from your pastor. Neither did the ancient Jews. The Levites were spread out throughout their country. Now, this nation eventually demanded of God, well, we want a king. And God was not exactly pleased with this because the idea of the Israelite nation was that God was to be their king, and they would have no human king. They would have human rulers and authorities, but not a king. But they demanded over and over again, and eventually God gave instructions to one of his prophets to find them a king, and told them exactly who to go and find. And so he went and he found this king. His name was Saul. Saul became king, and he was pretty good at first, but then he messed up pretty big, and he ends up kind of dying as an act of punishment for his sins. It's a pretty dark story to track. There's a little bit of civil war for a number of years within Israel, and eventually a new king rises to power, another king chosen by God. His name was David. Does that sound familiar to any of you guys? King David? You've probably heard stories about him if you've been around the church for a while. If not, here's your introduction. He was apparently short. It's just a fun little detail that we get that Saul was very tall and David wasn't. He was apparently short, so yeah, short kings stand up, but that works on two fronts. Anyways, if you guys don't know the slang term king, just ignore it. I forget my age sometimes. It's okay. Anyway. So he's apparently short. He's apparently very good looking. He was a wonderful military commander, and he was a pretty good governor too. Eventually, he becomes king of Israel. When he dies, there's some more intrigue, as kingdoms are wont to do, and one of his younger sons, not the one that should have inherited, but one of his younger sons, King Solomon, does that guy sound familiar? Comes to power. Now, there's a bunch of fun stories with King Solomon. He builds God a temple. It's amazing, and when King Solomon dies, the kingdom splits in half. There is the northern kingdom, which is still called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is now called Judah. So you have big Israel, and then later on you have two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. Are you guys tracking a little bit? Okay. The kingdom of Israel sins greatly against God repeatedly over and over again and has many different families come to power, normally through assassination and court intrigue, and eventually they are wiped out by an empire known as the Assyrians. Judah continues on their way, and they have some good kings and queens and some bad kings and queens. It's kind of a mixed bag, but David's family continuously rules in this nation for many generations. Eventually, however, the sin of Judah became so great that God said, I need to do something to correct this. You are idolatrous, you are murderers, you are mistreating foreigners and the poor, and you are not taking care of widows, and you're not offering the sacrifices you should be, and you're not worshiping with a pure heart. You're doing none of the things that my covenant says that you should do, and so I'm going to send you into exile. Not to destroy you, but to fix you. And they're told you will be in exile for 70 years. So build houses, make connections. You're going to be there for a while. And they're sent off into exile in the empire of Babylon. Babylon comes in under God's will and takes over Israel and sends many of the people to the city of Babylon and other cities in the region. And they become essentially a nation of slaves. Now, not slaves as we perceive slaves. They had many freedoms. They could own their own property. They had some amount of control over themselves. But the rule that Babylonians had for them was you cannot leave the place where we put you. You can practice your trade, buy houses, have children, and marry. You can practice your religion, so long as it doesn't conflict with ours. But you have to stay where you're placed. And this is important to the Jewish people because Israel was the land that God had promised them. Jerusalem was God's holy city where he would realize the promises yet to come. We almost can't grasp this, how important it is, because we aren't tied to a specific land anymore. When Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman, he says, there will come a day soon when you will not worship on this mountain where the Samaritans worship, and you will not worship in Jerusalem, but you will worship in spirit and in truth. I think Jesus is making a very practical point. It sounds very mystic, and I guess in some ways it almost is. But he's making a very practical point that physical locations of worship don't matter in Christianity like they did in Judaism and like they did to Samaritans, which are a near-Jewish group. But to the Jews, Jerusalem specifically and Israel as a whole, that was the place where you were supposed to be to worship and to follow God. That was the place you had to be if you wanted to receive God's blessings. And so when they were forced into Babylon, that meant they were separated from worship. It meant they were separated from God's promises. They were abandoned. They were in exile, physically and also spiritually. Fast forward around about 70 years, and a new kid on the block comes in. His name is Cyrus. He is a Persian king, and he takes over the empire of Babylon, which at this point is crumbling. And the Persians had a slightly different policy when it came to foreign people groups. Rather than force them into exile, which the Babylonians did to prevent rebellions, the idea is if you have problem kids, if there's like 4 problem kids in your class, right, you split them up. You make them sit at different tables. The Babylonians did that with entire ethnic groups. You split them up so they don't cause trouble, so they don't rebel. The Persians realized, wait. If we just let them stay together, but we're really nice to them, we probably won't have any problems with them, right? You had both types of teachers in high school, right? The ones who are like, I will rule with an iron fist, and the ones who are like, no, I'm just going to treat you like a little adult, and most of the time things are going to work out. The Persians were like the nicer kind, the one that you actually wanted to be your teacher. Maybe not the one you needed, looking at you, Dennis, but they were that nicer kind of teacher, right? And so they let the Jews return. If you wanted to, you were not forced to. You could stay where you were, but if you wanted to, you could return to your ancestral lands. So they let the Jews return to Israel. And that's who Nehemiah is asking about. Hey, those guys that got to go home, how are they doing? He asked them about those who had escaped, who had survived the captivity. And they said to me, now this is his either literal physical brother or brother in the sense hey, we're both Jews, so we're like brothers. Like at really old-fashioned Christian churches, they might say, oh, this is brother Paul's going to be giving us the announcement today, right? Like that kind of brother. Either way, he's talking to his brother. And this brother and these men with him reply, and they say, the remnant there, the people who returned, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and disgrace. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, the walls of Jerusalem had been broken down, and its gates had been burned with fire for a little over 100 years at this point. By the time we start talking about Nehemiah. The entire captivity had happened, and then people had been allowed to return, and they had been in Jerusalem for several decades. So it's not news that the walls have been destroyed, that the gate hasn't been rebuilt, that the city is defenseless. But there's an incident in Ezra chapter 4, which gets really stuck, because Ezra happens a number of decades before. He lives at the same time as Nehemiah, but he's a little bit older, and happens several decades before Nehemiah's story. In fact, actually, Ezra and Nehemiah used to be one scroll, and they were read together, one continuous story. So Ezra is in Jerusalem, and he's leading the people, and he's rebuilt the temple, and they've had so many successes, really, rebuilding the city. But there's this one interesting thing that gets inserted in Ezra chapter 4, a letter that happens in Nehemiah's time. It specifically says that Artaxerxes was the king. So this happens decades after the rest of Ezra chapter 4. It's really weird. But there's this letter inserted there that says that Artaxerxes had heard that they were rebuilding the walls of the city, and people had talked Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, the most powerful person in the land, the person who Nehemiah was serving in his court. This king, this Persian emperor, some people had sent a letter to him and said, hey, those Jewish people, they have a history of rebelling against anyone that rules over them. And that was true. When the Egyptians were in charge, they rebelled against the Egyptians. And the Babylonians were in charge, they rebelled against the Babylonians. The Jewish people are really, really good at rebellion, much like many of you when you were teenagers, right? And they send this letter to Artaxerxes and say, you should not allow them to rebuild the wall, because a wall is used for what? Defense in war. Why do they need a wall unless they're going to wage war against you? Now, this is kind of a slanted view, because the people in the area, we are told, repeatedly raided Jerusalem. These are other Persian subjects. But they strong-armed and raided and blackmailed the Jewish people and got resources out of them. This is a story that we're told in Ezra and in Nehemiah. And so these people, they have a vested interest in keeping Jerusalem weak so they can keep abusing Jerusalem. So Jerusalem will never have any power, and Jerusalem wants to be able to defend against them. Moreover, a city wall was a sign of status. The most important cities doubled as fortresses. They had defenses. It was a way of looking at a city and going, that city must be really important to the king because he built a wall around it. So they were in distress because they were in danger, and they were in disgrace because Jerusalem not having a wall is a way of saying this city is nothing. It's not important. The Persians don't care about it. Those Jewish people that live there, the king doesn't care if they die. They were in distress and disgrace because the wall was broken down and the gates had been burned with fire. These people are probably coming directly from Jerusalem after this letter to Artaxerxes had been sent, and we're saying, Nehemiah, we were going to rebuild the walls, but the king's gotten in the way. And the walls are still broken down, and we are still in distress. We are still in danger. We are still in disgrace. How does Nehemiah respond? How do you and I respond when something really bad happens? When I was engaged to Maggie, we had arranged, the school had only housing, the school that we were attending, because we got engaged in college. We were going to get married right before my senior year. So we had a little bit of time. We had to finish our degrees up. And the school only had housing for single people. So they had male dorms and female dorms. And so you had to be, living separate from your partner, i.e. probably not married, in order to live there. So if you were married and you wanted to, live with your spouse, as married people are wont to do, you had to find somewhere else to live. Well, they figured that out, and there were some apartments right across the street. So the school made an arrangement with the owner of the apartments that basically the school would lease the apartments from that owner for slightly lower than normal price because they'd be paying whether or not someone lived there. And then they would in turn turn around and lease those apartments to students so that married people would have a place to live. And it was pretty good price, and utilities were included, and they were fairly nice 2-bedroom apartments. They're obviously really close to the school. You could just walk to class. And so we're like, awesome, let's get in there. So we applied for an apartment, and school approved it, and we were all good. Well, about 3-4 weeks before we were supposed to get married, we were going to get married right after finals, and we were going to live that first summer together, and then go back to school in the fall. And right before, a month or so before the wedding, I get a call from the guy who's in charge of this at the school. He says, hey, I'm sorry, man, but we actually are not going to have an apartment for you. And I'm like, you told me that you're going to have an apartment for me like 2 weeks ago. What changed? And he's like, well, we have some people in front of you. It turns out that there's a little rule that the school had that if they hire someone and that person has to move and they need a place to stay, they get to jump the students in line on the apartments. Which sucks if you're the student that gets pushed out of the order. But that's the agreement they had. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because like your teachers need somewhere to live, and if you're asking someone to uproot their established life and move like 3 states over, you better make sure they have somewhere to sleep. I understand that, but being the guy who was just barely going to have an apartment, and now a month before my wedding I don't have one, I was panicking. Wouldn't you? So how do you think I respond? Being good and holy, I drop to my knees in prayer immediately. Oh, great Lord of the No. I said some choice words to the guy on the phone that I shouldn't have said, and I hung up on him. And then I started Googling apartments in nearby towns and in the town that we wanted to stay in, where the college was. And I said these exact words to Maggie. After I got off the phone, I said these exact words to her. I said, I am not going to let my wife start our married life homeless. Which is like, yeah, being a man, taking charge, right? That's how I felt. But I'm a Christian. And ultimately, I know I'm not the one in charge. I can't force someone to give me an apartment. I can't force a landlord to give me an opportunity, especially not on short notice like that. We had our back up against a wall, and there was not much time to find an apartment. And unless things really just fell into place, things that are outside of our control, we were not going to have somewhere to stay after our wedding. Now, we had people who were very generous, I'm sure would have given us a place, but we wanted to be independent. We wanted to have our place. We wanted to have our apartment. And instead of praying, I go, you know what? I'm going to fix this. And men, most of us have a proclivity to act that way. When we see a problem, our response isn't, let me ask God for help and then go do. Our response is, I'm going to fix it because I'm a man. That's what I do. Ladies, let's be honest though, many of you have that in you as well, right? After all, if you've spent your whole life putting out fires for other people and probably not being thanked for it, mothers, eldest daughters, workers who are constantly overlooked by your bosses, right? And so you're used to doing the exact same thing. Maybe you don't have the same bravado, because boys are taught from a young age to be like really like loud and obnoxious when we do something, and like, I don't know why, it's just the thing that we're taught, it's just in us, and then it's reinforced. But like, ladies, you probably do the exact same thing, you're just a little quieter about it. How many of us, when we run into a very difficult circumstance, our immediate response is, I'm gonna fix it, because I'm strong, and I'm independent, and I can do it on my own? But it's not the response that Nehemiah has. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept, and I mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Nehemiah hears this horrible news, and he's in a position of influence in the empire. He could have stormed into the king's court and demanded that the king rebuild the glorious city of Jerusalem because I am speaking for the Lord. My name is Nehemiah. He could have. Probably would have gotten executed. But he could have. And many of us, myself included, would be very tempted to have a response like that. Now, if I know that I might end up being beheaded for it, then I might like pause and be like, maybe there are better ways to go about this. But many of us, our response in this sort of situation is, let me fix it. How many of you, you've looked at your kid, and your kid's a full-grown adult, and they have a problem, and you look at your kid and you go, don't worry, honey, let me fix it, right? Your kid's like 22 years old. They don't really need your help. They might need a little advice, but you're like, no, let me fix it. How many of you, you've been in a situation, maybe it's not even your child, maybe it's just someone you know, a friend, maybe it's one of your parents even, if your parents are getting that age where now you're kind of taking care of them as well as them taking care of you, right? And you go, you know what, I'm going to get on the phone with that doctor right now. Even if you haven't done it, you've wanted to, right? That gut reaction, we're going to go fix it ourselves. But Nehemiah's first reaction is to mourn and fast and pray. So something big happens There is a great point of pain in Nehemiah's life, something he wants to change, and his response is to pray and to weep and to fast. Now, there's something that's really, really easy for us to read over because it's a foreign word in the first couple verses that we read. Let me go back real quick. Right after that space there, top of that big paragraph, now it happened in the month of Kislev, or Chislev. That's a Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. That falls in November, December. We're going to see another time marker a little bit later in this passage that mentions the month of Nisan, which is about 4 months later. 4 months. Let's actually just go ahead and go to that point. Here we have Nehemiah's recorded prayer. We'll come back to that in just a moment. In Nehemiah chapter 2, very last words of chapter 1 reminds us, I was cupbearer to the king. And then chapter 2, it says, it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him. I picked up the wine and gave it to the king. In the month of Nisan, 4 months later. What did Nehemiah do? For 4 months! Well, the Jewish people in Jerusalem were in distress and disgrace, being abused by their neighbors, being looked down upon by all the other subjects of the Persian Empire. What did he do for 4 months? Mourned, fasted, and prayed. In fact, we have that prayer recorded. I said, please, Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant and faithfulness for those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear now be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant which I am praying. To hear, Lord, hear our prayer. To hear the prayer of your servant which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants. Confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have committed against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept your commandments, nor the statutes or ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. And you said, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were the most remote parts of the heavens, I will gather them from there and bring them into the place where I have chosen to have my name dwell. In other words, if you repent, I will bring you back to Jerusalem, back to Israel. The prayer continues, they are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. Please, Lord, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayers of your servants who delight to revere your name. And please make your servant successful today and grant him mercy before this man. I wonder how many times Nehemiah prayed that prayer. I wonder if he ever prayed it worded exactly like this, or if as he's writing his story or having a scribe write the story for him later on, if it combines many of the prayers that he prayed. He says that he has been praying day and night for how long? 4 months. Then at the end of the prayer, he seems to indicate that maybe this is the last prayer he offered before he went before King Artaxerxes. Please make your servant successful today and grant him mercy before this man. Speaking out of turn or acting incorrectly in front of a Persian king could result in death or worse. Persians could be very creative in the ways that they got rid of people. If you don't believe me or you want an illustration, go read the book of Esther, which has some very colorful commentary at the end on how the great villain of the book is dealt with. Persians were a brutal people. In fact, most ancient peoples were. And Nehemiah, knowing what is at risk, knowing he could lose his life, he could lose his position, he could be tortured, maybe even punishments could be meted out on other Jewish people or his family as a result. He prays for 4 months before the Lord, and maybe this is the last prayer. We don't know, but maybe this is the last prayer he offers before he goes to King Artaxerxes. And he says, God, please make your servant successful. God, I know you're in control. God, I've been praying and fasting and mourning. God, please bless me. And so 4 months later, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, wine was before him. I picked up the wine and gave it to the king. It was his turn. There were many cupbearers. It was his turn to bring the wine before the king. Now, I had never been sad in his presence, and so the king said to me, why is your face sad? Are you ill? This is nothing but sadness of the heart, and I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, may the king live forever. This is a common way to greet a king. May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the site of my father's tombs, is desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? So the king said to me, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. He's been praying for 4 months. Do you think he's prayed enough yet? I thought so. In that last moment where he goes, man, the king can say yes, the king can say no, the king can kick me out of the court, the king could kill me, anything could happen. I don't know what's going to happen, man. He stops. I imagine he takes a breath. And I don't imagine this is a very eloquent prayer. You've been in these situations before where something big's about to happen and something in your brain goes, man, I should probably pray right now. And they're not eloquent prayers. They're never like, oh, Lord, you art great. And in Leviticus, it's never like that. It's like, help! That's what mine sound like. Just, God, help me out here. God, give me the word. God, just do something. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor before you, I request that you would send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Speaking to the very king that had forbidden the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem. Personally, he had forbidden it. When his governors and when his agents in the area said these people will rebel against you, this king, Artaxerxes, had forbidden it. And Nehemiah, after fasting and prayer with one last prayer on his lips, he says, King Artaxerxes, please help. Trusting the whole time that Artaxerxes wasn't the one in control. The heavenly king was. The king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. Months and months of prayer and mourning and fasting and more prayer, and then another prayer right before he goes in, and then a prayer as he's standing before the kings, and there's just a whole lot of prayer going on, a whole season of intense prayer over one issue. And the king says yes. Amazing. And it's stories like this that are inspirational. Here's the funny thing, though. When God is speaking of the Exodus, he tells the people it will be 70 years. But then in the book of Daniel, he talks about this extension to the Exodus. He says it will not be 70 years, but 70 times 7 years. There were aspects of the exile, and we see this in the post-exilic prophets like Micah. Even though the people had been returned to the land, there were still blessings from God they were expecting that they just weren't seeing. So the physical exile was over, but there's still a kind of exile going on. And the people were trying to puzzle through, and they're asking their prophets and their priests what's going on. And Micah says one of the issues is that you're not worshiping God purely. And there are other prophets that give more color to that answer. And when we know that God sent them out for 70 years, and now he's returned them from physical exile, but they're still not seeing the blessings that they expected when they returned to the land of Israel, and the Persians are still ruling over them, and they're having all of these problems. Do you think that maybe God could have said no? Could Nehemiah have prayed for 4 months, and then God said no? I think so. In this case, he didn't. But maybe something like this comes up in your life, not praying to rebuild the gates of an ancient city, but something serious, something deep, something hurtful comes up in your life, something that you feel the need to pray over for months and months and months, and you even fast, and you don't normally fast, but you're going to try it out because this is really serious, and maybe at the end of all of that, you're just waiting for God to respond with power, and he says, no. It's happened to me. I imagine it's probably happened to some of you, and if it hasn't yet, it probably will. But here's the thing. When Nehemiah seeks after God's will for months and months and months and months, he can at least be much more confident that whatever happens when I go before King Artaxerxes, if he says yes, then it was God's will. If he says no, it was God's will. If he kicks me out of the court, it was God's will. And even if he takes my life, it was God's will. Here's the thing that's so powerful about prayer. When we commit ourselves to deep prayer with a pure heart, with intentions to follow the will of God, we can at least be confident that whatever comes out of this situation, God is aware of it, God wills it, and that somehow, in some way, God will be glorified through it. Why commit yourself to a season of prayer? Because it just gives you so much confidence. It doesn't mean the outcome won't suck. It doesn't mean things won't be difficult. It doesn't mean that God will definitely say yes or definitely say no. But when you've brought something before the Lord, there's so much reassurance knowing that you've done your part. Now God's going to do his. So how are we going to empower our prayer life? I think we should follow the example of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was troubled, in this case by a very bad thing, but maybe you're troubled by a good thing. I got this amazing job offer. Should I leave my job? I have an opportunity to move closer to my family. Should I move? I think that there's this great investment opportunity, and I'm young enough to recoup my cost if it goes sideways, but is it really a good idea? There's this person that I think that I can mentor, but I'm really nervous to reach out to them. Maybe it's a good opportunity. Maybe it's something bad. A loved one's died, and I just can't get past the mourning. I'm on hard financial times, and I don't see a way out. Whatever it is, if there's something that is troubling you, something that is pricking at your soul, something that is heavy on you, well, Nehemiah was in the same place. Nehemiah was troubled. And he responds with prayer. 4 months of it, to be exact. But here's the funny thing. Nehemiah didn't just pray, God, please will Artaxerxes to repair the wall at Jerusalem, and then just go about his business. Nehemiah assumed that if I'm going to pray about it, if I'm going to fast about it, that when I get an opportunity, I'm going to do something about it too. Here's the thing. I err on the side of, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to be a man. I'm going to do it myself. And many of you, I imagine, are probably the same way. But there are some of us that we err on the side of, I'm going to pray about it and pray about it and pray about it and pray about it, but don't actually ask me to do anything. And Nehemiah says those are both wrong. He commits himself to prayer, and then he acts. Yeah. So what should we do? When trouble comes into your life, pray and then act. When big decisions are in your way, pray and then act. How can we empower our prayer lives? How can we be confident in the will of the Lord? Commit yourself to seasons of prayer. And when you're done, at the appropriate time when God gives you an opportunity, we're about to commit ourselves to a season of prayer here at Berean. Not over a single issue, but over many issues we think it's important for Christians to pray about. Issues in our community, issues in God's churches, both here and around the world. And then a whole week of time we'll be committing to praying over things that we should be thanking the Lord for and we so often overlook. Our community, our churches, and thankfulness. 3 weeks, 21 days of prayer. You heard about this morning, right? We're going to be gathering together with City Hope Church and with First Christian Church, our dear brothers and sisters in both of those congregations, and we're going to be meeting at 6 a.m. every weekday morning and 9 a.m. on Saturdays to gather for prayer and for worship. These seasons of prayer, they can shape in you a pattern of prayer. They can recommit you to the Lord, and I hope that they do. We offer prompts every day, things that we think that the churches should be praying over. But you know what? Maybe for some of you, you need to do a season of prayer like Nehemiah. Maybe there's just that one thing that's been sticking out. Is it time to retire? Is it time to go back to work? Should I reach out to that family member that I haven't spoken to in so long? Maybe there's an issue at the church that you're aware of that you want to be praying over. It's going to be Brandy's first month with us. I'm sure she's going to want your prayers. And of course, I always covet your prayers as well. And so we invite you to practice the Nehemiah thing for like a fourth of the amount of time that he did it for, right? We're making it easier for you to commit yourself to a season of prayer, to empower your prayer life, to seek after the will of God. As always, we want to put our teaching where our mouth is. When we give you the opportunities to live out the things that we're teaching you about. Let's pray. Lord, as we're gearing up, or gearing down, I guess, for the end of summer and gearing up for 21 days of prayer, I would ask your blessing on this church, and not in like some vague way. Very specifically today, I want to ask that you would make us a prayerful church, a church that in all areas of our lives we seek after you. We bless you and worship you and ask for your interference in our lives. That we'd be a thoughtful church that understands when you are silent and understands when you say no, but nonetheless that we would be a believing church that knows that you are willing and able to act when your glory, when your name demands it, that you are a God that ultimately will defend your church, that you will move in righteous and just ways in this life and in the next. God, we love you. We want to be more like you. We want to pray like Jesus did, and like Nehemiah, and like so many other of your servants throughout history. In Jesus' name, and for your glory, we pray. Amen.